gives me great pleasure to introduce a comrade, a writer, and a thinker who's been in demonstration, challenging politicians, writing very interesting articles. Shabbir Lakha, who will talk to us about this brief history of Palestine. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was a really nice introduction. I think, just to start, I think it is a very topical meeting. I think there's never a wrong time to talk about Palestine, but I think given the developments in the last year, it's particularly pertinent to be talking about Palestine. And as we speak right now, Israel is attempting to demolish a village called Counterfire next to West Bank, and it's so far been delayed in doing so because the Palestinians have been resisting against it. I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. I'm going to try and run through 100 years of history very quickly and briefly. So I'll get straight into it. I think that a good place to start in the history of Palestine is to talk about the origin of Zionism, which came about in the late 19th century as a response to rising anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe. You had pogroms in Tsarist Russia. You had the predecessors of Hitler's Nazism, and a general sense, a general hostility against Jewish people across Europe. And this led to a number of Jewish thinkers to come up with the concept of Zionism, the idea of self-determination for the Jewish people as an ethnic group as such. It wasn't always initially supposed to be a Jewish state in Palestine. There were various options that came up, and there were various different strands within Zionism about what a Jewish state could look like, where it could be. There were negotiations with the leading powers of the world at the time, including Britain, and various offers were made. Most famously, Britain offered the Zionist movement an area of land in East Africa, which was considered at one of their congresses and then rejected. But I think some of the key things to know about Zionism is that when it originated, it was a minority current within the Jewish population of Europe. In fact, there was a strong backlash against it by a lot of Jewish people who felt that the premise of Zionism, that Jewish people need their own state, confirms anti-Semitic rhetoric that Jewish people are not normal citizens of European countries, and that this would in fact feed anti-Semitic rhetoric. But anyway, moving on, in 1903, I believe it was, the World Zionist Federation voted decisively to make central to Zionism the idea that a Jewish state has to be in Palestine and nowhere else. And this was against the strands of territorialists. There were some socialist Zionist strands who were defeated in this vote, and it became a central part of Zionism that a state had to be in Palestine. During the First World War, the Ottoman Empire, which at that time ruled most of the Middle East, including Palestine, allied themselves with Germany, and Britain organized Arab peoples within the Ottoman Empire to revolt against the Ottomans, to help the defeat of the Ottomans. And in return, they were promised freedom and self-determination. And this is famously captured by the Hussein McMahon correspondence in 1915, where there was letters between McMahon and the chief, the Grand Sheriff of Jerusalem, Hussein, where basically Britain, just about short of promising to give freedom, particularly Palestinians, but to all Arab people who supported Britain in opposing the Ottomans. And we also all know about Thomas Edward Lawrence, who was sent as Britain's kind of envoy, particularly in Iraq, to make similar kind of promises. Interestingly, what wasn't known until much later was that T.E. Lawrence was specifically told not to make any concrete promises and to just allude to the idea of freedom. And this came to a head when Britain signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, which was a secret agreement between Britain and France to split the Middle East between Britain and France. And the line that they drew in the sand across the Middle East went from above Palestine to below Lebanon and Syria, across to the top of Iraq and under Iran. And this was a secret agreement. It was directly in violation of the promises and of the correspondence they had with the Arab peoples, but no one knew about it at the time. And declassified documents show that the thinking behind this agreement was between competing imperialisms between France and Britain, and from the British perspective, the main priority was to secure transport links between the Suez Canal, which was under British control, and the Persian Gulf, which would provide a land route for goods produced in British-occupied India across the Middle East to the Suez Canal and then up the Mediterranean to Britain. And that was the main thinking behind it. It was that they needed to make this railway across, and they wanted to have that security of knowing that France couldn't intervene in that. This was then followed in 1917 by the infamous Balfour Declaration, which was made by Britain's then Foreign Secretary, Lord Arthur Balfour, where he pledged the British government's support for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And there was a number of versions of the declaration before the final one that we know of today. And interestingly, it was in one of the last versions that was added in that respect of the indigenous population has to be there as part of the declaration, in a way of kind of appeasing the limiting the backlash from the Arab peoples who were rightfully concerned about what this meant for the agreement they had with the British people. Interestingly, again, during the cabinet meetings that were happening at the time of discussing this declaration and what would be in it, a number of ministers, including Balfour, recognized and acknowledged that the only way that a Jewish homeland could be created in Palestine would be through colonialism, would be through dispossessing the existing population. But they thought this was a perfectly acceptable thing to do. In 1917, when there was the Russian Revolution, immediately after the Bolsheviks came to power in Russia, they made public the Sykes-Picot Agreement. They published it in the Pravda, and most of the world didn't know about it at the time. The Arabs who found out were obviously enraged by this, but it was kind of too late, because not long after the First World War ended, the Ottoman Empire had collapsed, and Britain had positioned its troops to occupy Palestine as well as Transjordan, as was known then in Iraq. And shortly after this, the League of Nations was formed, which created the basis for colonial powers to what was known as mandates, to have these mandates of these countries. And the idea was to prepare these countries for self-rule, because they were backward, savage people who couldn't rule themselves, and Britain had to prepare them for that. And that was the idea of the mandate system under the League of Nations. But because of the promise that Britain had made to the Zionist Federation, shortly after it took over the mandate of Palestine, it began mass immigration of Jewish people from Europe to Palestine. And there was initially a kind of acceptance from the indigenous Palestinian population. There were little colonies being set up in various uninhabited parts of Palestine. This slowly started becoming more organized, started involving more friction between the communities and fights over resources, and eventually became a problem. in the 1930s, there was a series of revolts against the British by the Palestinian population. I think the biggest was around 1936, which was kind of inspired by the Easter Rising in Ireland in 1916. And I think one thing that helps crystallize what's happening now from then was the formation of an organization called the Histadrut, which was set up as a trade union organization by the Zionist organization, and it was a Jewish exclusive union which refused to organize Palestinian workers. And when the Palestinians attempted a general strike against, in order to undermine the British in opposition to the colonization of their land, the Histadrut, one of the first things that they did after forming was to organize strike breakers to make sure that these strikes were ineffective. This organization then went on to become Israel's second biggest employer after the state. It carried on being a Jewish exclusive union. In 1947, after the Second World War, Britain could no longer afford to maintain its mandate in Palestine. Their resources were depleted after the war, and there was increasing tensions, which resulted in a lot of British soldiers, in casualties of British soldiers in Palestine. And so Britain initially asked the United States, who was a newly emerged power following the end of the Second World War, to commit 100,000 troops to Palestine to help support the mandate. And the United States categorically refused. They said they don't want to be involved in this. And so Britain went to the newly formed United Nations and asked for their help. The United Nations, following the recommendations of the Peel Commission in 1939, adopted what was then known as the Partition Plan, where historic Palestine was split up with about 56% of the land dedicated to a Jewish state, about 46% of the land for a Palestinian state, and Jerusalem was meant to be an international zone which would be governed by the UN and neither state. The Palestinians rejected this offer. They said, we don't accept this, and immediately civil war broke out between the Jewish and the Palestinian populations. This then became known as the First Arab-Israeli War because the neighboring Arab countries got involved to support the Palestinians. And during this process, during this period between 1947 and 1949 is also what the Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, which is the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. During this period, over 500 Palestinian villages were razed to the ground. Over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled, and there is opposition from pro-Israeli historians about how Palestinians were expelled exactly, and the reality is that some Palestinians were literally told, you have to leave, whereas other Palestinians were implicitly told to leave by example, in that what the Jewish militias, known as the Haganah and I forget the names, the Ergen and others did, would they would destroy a village, kill a lot of people, send one person as a messenger to the next village to tell the people what happened in that previous village, and everyone would be scared and would leave. And famously, a lot of the Palestinians who left still to this day have the keys to their homes because they were expecting to return home after the war, not knowing what would happen. This ended in 1949 with an armistice agreement where Israel had, or the newly created state of Israel had set itself up as an entity within 78% of historic Palestine, and what's now known as the West Bank was given to Jordan. That's why it's called the West Bank. It's the West Bank of the Jordan River. And Egypt was in control of the Gaza Strip. This was obviously not an ideal situation for the Palestinians. There was 750,000 refugees in neighboring Arab countries who couldn't come back. The Jordanians and Egyptians weren't particularly happy with having to govern this land either, and there was a lot of tensions. This eventually culminated in 1967 with the Second Arab-Israeli War, when a number of the Arab countries, neighboring countries, attempted to invade Israel again. And the Israeli army at the time was overnight bolstered by the British and American by weapons and funding and forces, and they eventually won the war. And this time they pushed out the Jordanians and the Egyptians from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and took over control of the entire of historic Palestine. And this is when, after which, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip became known as the occupied Palestinian territories, because they were occupied. Immediately after this war, Israel began settlement building in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I'm just a bit wary of time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. In 1973, there was the Yom Kippur War. In 1987, there was the beginning of the First Intifada, which was a peaceful uprising by the Palestinian population, which was eventually, which faced a lot of repression from the Israeli government at the time, but ultimately ended with the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993. And these Oslo Accords were again decided secretly behind closed doors and through backdoor channels between the PLO and the Israelis via Norway. At the time, it was seen as a great first step in the peace process, and what it achieved was to create an interim Palestinian government whereby the PLO could be a legitimate entity in Palestine, because up until that point, the PLO were not allowed to operate in Palestine. They were an illegal body. They operated in Lebanon, Jordan, Tunisia, and they faced a lot of opposition in those places as well. But after the Oslo Accords, they were allowed to govern Palestine as per the Accords. But in hindsight, what the Accords did was to legitimize Israel's occupation of Palestine. What it did was that it allowed Israel to have full control of the borders between Palestine and Israel, and based entirely on military interests. It split up the West Bank into areas A, B, and C, where Area A is in full Palestinian civil and military control. Area B is in Palestinian civil but Israeli military control, and Area C is under full Israeli control. Area A makes up roughly 10% of the West Bank. Area B is, I think, a further 20-something%, and Area C is over 60% of the West Bank. And furthermore to this was that the way it was split up wasn't just Area A, B, and C, but areas A and B are encircled by Area C. So, and this is why people often get confused when they hear about 700 checkpoints within the West Bank, which are between Palestinian villages in the West Bank. It's because the areas which are under Palestinian control are encircled by the areas which are in Israeli control. It was also very calculated in terms of its economic impact. One of the tenets of the Oslo Accords was the Paris Protocol, which encouraged economic cooperation between Israel and Palestine. And in reality, what it did was that it allowed the areas C that were apportioned to coincidentally be the most fertile areas of land, to be the areas which covered the water resources, etc. And it's in these areas C that Israel was able to build these settlements almost legally. Today, what we have, what we call those areas, has been referred to as Bantustanization, which is a comparison with apartheid South Africa in the way the indigenous black population of South Africa were pushed into these Bantustans, as they were called, these small areas, ghettos even, just for black people. And it's a similar picture in terms of Palestinian villages in the West Bank. To this day, Israel controls all the water resources in the entire historic Palestine. It controls all the electronic and telecommunications infrastructure. And to give you just an example about the way these resources are distributed, illegal settlers who live in the West Bank have 3 times more access to water than the Palestinians in the West Bank living in nearby villages. What the Oslo Accords also did was create an Israeli customs union, which allowed Israel to be in complete control of what is imported and exported by Palestine, what tax revenues they receive, and we saw how Israel uses this a few years ago when UNESCO decided to recognize Palestine as a state. Israel decided to punish the Palestinians by freezing some several $1 million owed to them in tax revenue that had been collected through this customs union. It also ensured the labor dependency of Palestinians on the Israeli economy because the Palestinian economy is not able to create its own jobs simply because manufacturing was completely developed. The agricultural industry was destroyed by the fact that most of the fertile land was rezoned military zones or taken over by Israeli settlements. And because of the border control that Israel put in place, it meant that Israel was in charge of where and when Palestinians can get permits to work in settlements or in Israel. And so Palestinians are dependent on the Israeli labor market rather than the other way around. And this is something that people say is one of the only distinctions between apartheid South Africa and Palestine, is that during apartheid in South Africa, the indigenous black population were very much a part of the labor market in South Africa, and it gave them the power to fight back at that time. Anyway, sitting through. So in 2000, there was the second Intifada, which was a violent uprising. In 2006, the Gaza Strip voted Hamas into power. In 2007, Israel began its siege of Gaza, which remains to this day one of the harshest sieges in human history. Just another short example, 95% of the water in Gaza is unfit for human consumption. And there are regular offensives in Gaza, as I'm sure you all know from watching the news. In 2008 and 2009, there was Operation Cast Lead, where over 2,000 Palestinians were killed. This was an air and ground offensive in one of the most densely populated areas on the planet. There was the use of white phosphorus, which is a chemical weapon. There was the use of depleted uranium bullet shell casings, which to this day is causing birth defects and cancer. In 2012, there was Operation Protective Edge, which was an air offensive which killed about 500 people. 2014, there was Operation Pillar of Cloud, which was again an air and ground offensive, killed over 2,000 people, of which 500 of which were children. And so you can see the kind of pattern of what's happening here. And to bring us into 2018, we saw last year Donald Trump announce the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which is in complete violation of international law, and has also meant that any future negotiations between Palestine and Israel start from the basis of Jerusalem is not on the table. It also coincided with the beginning of what has been known as the Great Return March, which was at the end of March, end of May, where Palestinians in Gaza began gathering at the border fence with Israel to demand the right of return, which is a right they are afforded under international law. And Israel's response to this was heavy sniper fire, indiscriminately shooting at unarmed protesters. Last that I saw, the death toll, it's been happening every Friday, these protests, and the last I saw was the death toll was over 180 people, which includes medics such as Razan al-Najjar, who was shot in cold blood, and journalists, and a lot of children. And there have been over 15,000 Palestinians who have been shot in this period. So that's the kind of picture we're seeing. We saw that Netanyahu's government recently passed the nation-state law, which codifies in law that Palestinians don't have the right to self-determination. And although this is a shock and an outrage, there are over 50 active laws in Israel that discriminate between Arab Israeli citizens and Jewish Israeli citizens, such as the right of return, such as Jewish Israelis are not permitted to marry Palestinians, and so on and so forth. And I think the main things I want to try and get across from this and leading into the contemporary situation and how we should be responding as people who support Palestine is that Zionism is racist. Ultimately, Zionism necessarily made the colonization of Palestine a part of Zionism, and we need to recognize that. That the Zionist project was completely and inherently linked to settler colonialism and to Western imperialism. That apartheid is not only not a wrong term to describe Palestine, the situation in Palestine, but it was very much deliberate. Something that I've seen pro-Israeli people argue often when you point out some of the injustices that are happening in Palestine is that this was born of the Palestinians did this and therefore we had to resist in this way. You know, there was the second intifada, that's why we built the wall. But the reality is that it was very much deliberate. The picking of the areas which were to be zoned in certain ways, the economic policies, etc., was all very deliberate, and apartheid is a very accurate term because you see the clear discrimination in terms of within the West Bank you have roads which are accessible to Jewish people only, you have transport links which are accessible to Jewish people only. You have administrative detention for Palestinians, which means that they can be arrested and detained indefinitely on secret evidence. You have one of the highest populations of child prisoners in Israel, and you have, and this is the Palestinian population being imprisoned in Israel, which again is a transfer of the population and is a violation of international law. You have house demolitions and okay. So to kind of sum up, I think what we've seen is that the peace process is effectively a sham. Donald Trump put the final nail in the two-state solution, if it wasn't already. And I think we need to recognize what we can do as the Palestine solidarity movement in this crucial time. And it is a crucial time because Britain, for one, has had one of the strongest Palestine solidarity movements in the world for a long time. And particularly now we have a leader of the Labour Party who has been a staunch supporter of Palestine for most of his adult life. And that is one of the reasons why he's facing such a backlash on this issue. And we also have a British state that is very much connected to not only the creation of Israel historically, but in the maintaining of Israel's rule over Palestine and its position as an outpost for Western imperialism in the Middle East. And we have this heavy influence of Israel in Britain. We have, for example, Some of you might have seen the Al Jazeera expose last year, which showed how the Israeli embassy was organizing to undermine Jeremy Corbyn, to undermine Malia Watia, who was the president of the NUS at the time, and various other things. You had Priti Patel, who, when she was the Minister for Development, was having secret meetings in Israel with Netanyahu and other ministers, and was trying to find a way to divert international aid money to the Israeli military. We've seen time and time again the BBC and other mainstream media outlets show their bias. Most recently, there was a headline, some of you might have seen that the BBC put out when there was a pregnant Palestinian mother in Gaza who died as a result of an airstrike. And they put a headline which said Israel strikes kill Palestinian mother, or something like that. And they got a complaint from the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and they immediately changed the headline to Gaza strike kills Palestinian, or something like that. So there's this constant bias, and some of you might even remember when Tony Benn, during the offensive in Gaza in 2008, had to announce the DEC appeal himself, because the BBC for the first time in 40 years refused to announce the appeal. And so anyway, so this is the kind of context we're facing, and I think we are in a unique position that we're in a country which is so central to the maintaining of this injustice in Palestine. At the same time, we have this huge solidarity movement, and we have Jeremy Corbyn in the position that he's in. And we need to remember to make Palestine the issue constantly. The more we do, the better, in a better position we are. And we need to mobilize constantly, because when we have an impact here, it has a direct impact there. I think I'll leave it there and we'll have a discussion.
Thank you. Shabbir, before we open into questions, let me get this right. So we have a minority Zionist movement in the 19th century that hasn't really had much of a support by Jewish people, but has great support from the imperialists of the time, whose interests are served by utilizing that sort of development to open railways, open that gateway to Middle East and beyond. At the same time creating, first of all, a mass immigration of Jewish people, then orchestrating all the alchemy about how the whole thing is going to work out, and then creating civil wars, more unrest, and more recently systemic, sort of systematic economic, political, and military attack to innocent people. And our elected politicians don't get that basic historical analysis.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? Okay, right. I think that's my thank you for answering. Open to you guys. Please.
Yeah, I just thank you very much for that. It's amazing how little you learn about that in school, and also just even if you pay attention to like the more left-leaning newspapers and look out for these sort of articles to describe that whole historical process, I haven't seen it, to be honest, really. I think especially in school, I don't remember ever learning anything about that sort of relation between Israel and Palestine. And it just seems like such a critical part of understanding what's going on in the Middle East. But I don't know if anyone knows a bit more about whether that's on the curriculum now or not. But it seems it's not. But that is totally political, isn't it? So I don't know. I think maybe pushing for education around that area could be one tip as well.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So just going off of what you said, I don't know if you can hear, I'm not from here, but I'm trying to understand like UK politics as much as I can, and in the US it's very much like people who are Republicans usually obviously support the Israeli state because a lot of hardcore Republicans in the US are very, very Jewish themselves, and I was just wondering, like, is it the same here then? Is like the right wing supportive of the Jewish state because a lot of them are? What's going on?
Yeah, that's really quite interesting because they will get angry at one time quite right-wing and conservative, but on this one issue, I really am pro-Palestine and more Jeremy Corbyn. But you're absolutely right. Most right-wing go the other way, and left-wing tend to go pro-Palestine. But I am different. But people say things like, "Oh, how can you be pro-Palestine?" and things like that. Well, actually, because of, like the gentleman said, with the history, because of the history, they that's why I'm pro-Palestine.
I was just wondering more if like if the right wing politics are like supporting the Israeli state, is it because they get actual funds for their political campaigns and like their political things? Because that's basically the case in the US.
It's more nuanced than that here because the right wing tends to be more sort of.
Please,
Sorry.
direct the question to Shabbir, and we can carry on with the discussion, but do you have some?
No, I was just going to say it's slightly more nuanced than that, and the right wing tends to be sort of more colonialism patriotic in terms of their history. So it's not like although some may be receiving lots of money, I'm not sure it's as much as in America where it's all the Jewish giving them the money.
Okay.
But it may well be.
Penny.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously that the arms sales are a huge factor in who's supporting what. And Palestinians, there are no capitalist interests in Palestine, basically. It's all about supporting and getting money from Israel for the arms trade, etc. That's a huge part of it. But when you talked about school and education, I mean, we've seen this time and time again with oppressed people, thinking back to Ireland, during the so-called Troubles. How many of us actually know what's happening with the Catholic population, what the discrimination was there? It wasn't something that was talked about. It was just all a very difficult, complicated situation, and leave it to, the powers that be there to sort it out. I think what's worse with Palestine this year is the extreme toxicity that's developed around the discussion, because we can sit in rooms with lots, very like-minded, seemingly like-minded people, and then when you come to this issue, there's this horrible divide where I was talking to somebody who was on a Labour Party stall, and I'm not in the Labour Party, but I was congratulating on the leaflets about defending the NHS, and I live in a very strong Jewish area in Prestwich, and the first thing this person wanted to talk to me about was how awful Jeremy Corbyn was for the mural in London and stuff like that. And I kind of went, what, so you actually feel that's more important than austerity, education, tuition fee, and you're putting me off now voting Labour. And I was on your side when I walked up. And I think that's where, we have to be very, very clear about the history and the struggle and what's led to this. And these kind of articulations of Zionism that are showing, and things that people are latching onto are being, even if I say blown out of proportion, I could be accused of being, a troublemaker sort of thing, Zionist. Because a Zionist, because I dare to say that I don't feel these issues are as important, which is heartbreaking, and I can't imagine how Jeremy Corbyn must feel, having fought on the side of the oppressed all his life, to then feel that people would think that he wouldn't want to support the oppressed. And I think that's probably a very difficult place to have a debate at the moment.
Thanks, Remy. So, if you don't mind, we'll take one more from Martin, and then we can reflect back into this audience participation that's very passionate.
The comment earlier, I just think it's important that we do sometimes quite a bit of a discrete path between Zionism and Judaism, actually. Because, as Shabbir talked about in his talk, the history of Jews supporting Zionism is contested and has moved around over the years. Secondly, a lot of the biggest supporters of Israel, certainly the states of Christians, fundamentalist Christians often, into the right-wing fundamentalist Christians, also tend to support Zionism. And also, I think the most powerful Zionists in Britain are not Jewish. They're just members of the Conservative and the Labour Party, maybe from all manner of backgrounds. So I think it's important to remember that. In terms of, I also think that perhaps when we're thinking about America, Britain and Israel, that we don't, I'm not saying anyone in the room do this by the way, I'm just saying it's something you hear, we don't let the tail wag the dog, and we remember actually it's in the strategic interest geopolitically of the West to support Israel. It's not about Israel taking over the West and sort of more conspiratorial things you hear from some people on occasion. It's about Western political interests in the Middle East, which are absolutely designed to some extent on support for Israel. We should remember that Balfour also, of course, referred to correctly the loyal little Ulster. Speaking of some of Irish Catholic background, you know, in the Middle East when he talked about wanting to create Israel, and that's and this, of course, he was saying that exactly just at the point after the majority of the island of Ireland was trying to get independent from Britain, rather than have the six campus at the top, didn't want to, because they were all aware of that mansion. So the point I'm making is it's been about Western imperialist interest. Of course, Israel is its own thing outside of that, obviously, but fundamentally the pushing of it has been to do with, you know, it's been part of the geopolitics of capitalism in the last 100 years. Remember that.
Thanks, Martin. Great.
Okay, so Martin kind of took that point a bit, but just to expand slightly, I think you're absolutely right, and I think it is important to remember that in the West, the biggest supporters of Zionism are not Jewish people. Israel had to work really hard since its creation to create this feeling within the Jewish communities that stayed in Britain and the US and elsewhere to have this attachment to Israel. And what we're seeing in recent years is the deterioration of this attachment. A recent survey, I think it was in 2015, showed that I think it was 59% of British Jewish people consider themselves Zionists, which is just above half, and it's also down from 78% in the previous survey, which was 2 years before that. I mean, I don't have the full stats of that survey, but it was stuff like 70-something% of Jewish people support the right of Palestinian self-determination, 24% even supported sanctions on Israel, that kind of thing. So we do need to separate Jews and the Jewish community with Zionism. And in the US, it is primarily Christian Zionists and evangelicals who support Israel. And this isn't just the Republicans even, it's the mainstream Democrats too. Hillary Clinton, for example, one of the biggest supporters of Israel on that side. One thing they do is to use the support of Israel to excuse anti-Semitism. We've seen this most recently with Trump, for example, who on Holocaust Memorial Day failed to mention the Holocaust, who's consistently given a platform to the alt-right, who've been saying all kinds of anti-Semitic things. And yet, when he was accused of anti-Semitism, the first person to come to his defense was Netanyahu. To say, no, he supports Israel, he's not anti-Semitic. And we've seen that time and time again. So I think, and this to the question of funding as well, I think obviously in the US, the political system is all kinds of whack. And there is there is this issue of funding and unlimited spending on campaigns, and that's why groups like AIPAC and the rest of them can have such a disproportionate influence on the politics. In the UK, we don't as much. There is limits on spending, and most the main political parties are able to spend that much without needing massive donations. Of course, they do get massive donations anyway, but it's not as big of an issue. But I think what Martin said is really important in that it's not, would you say the tail wagging the dog? It's the other way around, which is that, Israel and its presence in the Middle East is very much beneficial to the West, as much as it is the other way around. And in fact, I'm going to correct you, sorry. It wasn't Balfour who said.
As I said, that was doing right.
No, you wanted to Ulster. It was, and I'm correcting you, but I've forgotten his name. But he was the first governor of Jerusalem. Something with R. But anyway, but the rest of the quote that he says is that we want to create a loyal little Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism. And I think that kind of puts it into context that the way Britain and the imperial powers saw Israel was that we want to have control of this area, we want to have control of the resources, we want to have control of the transport links, which can connect our empire or whatever. But we're faced with a sea of people who want their own rights, and this will be our way to stop that. And then just a little bit about the anti-Semitism debate. I mean, yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous that Jeremy Corbyn, staunch anti-racist, is now referred to as a racist and an anti-Semite. And I was giving out leaflets for the November 17th demo the other day, and someone took a leaflet and then came back 2 minutes later and said, "I hope you're going to protest against Jeremy Corbyn too. He's the biggest racist of them all." And it's like, you don't even know what to say to these people. I mean, you have the rise of the far right. You have 41% increase in hate crimes since last year. Jeremy Corbyn's a racist, but this is something that Israel and its Western supporters in the West have used since the creation of Israel as a means of defending Israel, is to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. It's a very much coordinated campaign to paint any opposition to Israel as anti-Semitic. And that's why there's been all this furor around the IHRA definition, because of the example which says that essentially calling Israel a racist state or a racist endeavor is anti-Semitic. And the way that definition has practically been used is to undermine the BDS campaign, which is growing and having increasing success, because the BDS campaign is premised on the idea that Israel is racist, that there is apartheid happening, and this is our best tactic to oppose it. And so if you say that saying that is anti-Semitic, then you can say BDS is anti-Semitic, and therefore anyone who tries to show solidarity with Palestine can be branded anti-Semitic. And yes, it's absolutely created this toxic environment, but I think the way to counter it is to talk about Palestine. I've seen a lot of people go down the rabbit hole of trying to very specifically say why this particular thing is not anti-Semitic and Jews and this and whatever. It's not helpful. The way we win this argument is by making Palestine front and center. It is to say, this is what has happened to the Palestinians. This is why calling Israel a racist is not only not anti-Semitic, but it's absolutely accurate, etc. So I think that's what we need to be doing. We need to be on the offensive of Palestine. We need to be telling as many people as possible about it. And we need to be connected to the wider movement. We need to be ready to mobilize, be out on the streets in our communities to make these arguments.
Any more questions from the floor?
It's just a clarification really, because when you start talking about Zionism at the beginning, you mentioned ethnic and religious, and I was wondering if you could just sort of pull that apart a bit, because I get confused over. I sort of know what religious means, but I sort of get confused with ethnicity.
Any more? Well, let's take this question and then people.
Okay, yeah, I mean, this is a slightly tricky one, but basically, as part of rising anti-Semitism in the 19th century, maybe even earlier than that, was the kind of racialization of Jewish people, i.e., Jewish people prior to that happening were a religion. You were a Jew if you believed in Judaism. But I think it was the 19th century, I might be wrong about this, but during the 19th century, as part of the kind of tropes that were coming out against Jewish people, began framing Jewish people as an ethnic group. The kind of things about hook-nosed and whatever, created this ethnic identity of Jewish people, and that is why you have today people who are atheists but are Jewish, and so on and so forth. So I think that kind of answers that. If there's more you want.
Atheist and Jewish?
Yeah, so you have like secular Jews who are Jewish because their mother was Jewish, but they don't necessarily believe in Judaism. And this has become the distinction between the ethnicity and the race. is almost similar to what's happening with Muslims today, in that brown-looking people can be Muslim-looking and are being racialized by people who are racist against them. Okay, they're the tangents.
Thank you. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, I'm still. I'm absorbing it slowly.
I guess perhaps what we could do,
I
put
suppose-
some references to read up on as well.
Because I suppose the reverse is the same with Israel as a state and a religion within that state, but also having people who are different but not the same within that state.
Not following at all.
So again, I suppose we've got Israel, it's the state of Israel, that's got a religious identity, but there's people living in Israel who don't follow that religion, and therefore they're not fully Israeli, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
Would that be an ethnicity?
So Israel characterizes itself as the Jewish state of Israel, and it is premised as an ethnocratic state, which is primarily why when they deny Palestinians the right to self-determination, Arab Israelis, Christians, Muslims, or otherwise, are not treated as full Israeli citizens. They are treated as second-class citizens.
If I can come in here, it's also, of course, been an attempt to, at various times, to say that certain groups of Africans who are considered themselves Jews and not Jews. And there has been, what we could broadly call white on black racism in the broadest possible way. If anyone follows or read today's sheet blogs, he's very good on all this stuff, or on Facebook, he's written a lot on it. Specifically about, which really do function in many ways, exactly like any kind of form of white people against black people racism would do in the West in many ways, and have the same sort of tropes. And there was, I can't remember which particular group, but I think some Ethiopian Jews very recently were essentially told they weren't really Jewish. And in terms of the custom right to return, there's also actual legal aspects of this, isn't there, as well as just people's right to go to synagogue and be part of whichever branch of Judaism and so on and so forth. I mean, I remember being at a debate 30 years ago when I was in my late teens with a predominantly Jewish audience about whether Judaism was a race or a religion, and most people couldn't decide there, and I was mostly Jewish people, so it's very contested.
Thanks, Martin. Karen.
I had a conversation the other day with a friend who would consider to the left is not an activist or anything like that, and he was talking about this subject, and he says, he really surprised me because he turned around and said, why don't just Palestinian people just leave and give up because they're never going to win, and also because this is they'll like Trump and all those superpowers are going to crush them anyway, and they're all going to die if they don't go. And then he's saying that, and they're also undermining the government here. So isn't it better to just let it happen and get Palestinian people to move away? And I was like, but then wouldn't they just come after? You can't allow that, can you? Because that's just how they're going to win, and that's those people's homes and lives and stuff. But also because you're allow that to happen, where will it stop as well? I'm just wondering what you would have said to that. Because I was quite surprised that you would have said that, because he's normally on the side of the oppressed. I don't know if there is anything else to say tonight.
I think an important thing to note is that the reason we still have this question of Palestine is because Palestinians have been resisting for 70 years. Had they not, we wouldn't. But this is the point, is that a lot of people who support Israel claim Palestinians are made out there, non-entity, whatever, they should go back to Jordan, they can live there, whatever. But the point is, that's not their country, this is their homeland, and they should have never been colonized, and they shouldn't stop fighting.
So it's kind of what I said, that we can't not fight for them, partly because we're so involved as the UK, because we do, full support of that Israeli state, and so I saw it like that. But that argument as well, that it could undermine Corbyn and then undermine us here, I still don't feel it's a still strong enough argument to abandon the Palestinian people. Sure. So I suppose I was on the right lines there, and I wasn't
Yeah.
There wasn't anything else I could have added.
I was just going to ask, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were talking about ethnic cleansing and things like that. Wasn't there around during the late 40s or 50s or whatever? Wasn't there a lot of Palestinian people who were kind of like refugees to Egypt, for example? Is that true?
Yeah. So during the 1947 to 1949 Arab-Israeli War, there was 750,000 approximately Palestinians who pushed out of Palestine. The majority of whom went to Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and some to Egypt, not as many. During the 1967 Second Arab-Israeli War, there was a further 200,000 to 300,000 Palestinians again pushed out. There are today 7 million Palestinian refugees, and they have a special categorization of refugees because of the ongoing conflict, whereby their children are also classified as Palestinian refugees and so on. But this is a particularly important issue because of what Trump has just done, which is to change the United States understanding of this. So the United States no longer recognizes any second or third or fourth generation Palestinian refugees as refugees. So as far as the United States is concerned, there's about 500,000 or so Palestinian refugees, and that's all. And the result of that is that they've massively defunded UNRWA, which is the specific UN body that deals with Palestinian refugees. And I think a testament to the Palestine solidarity movement here and the Labour movement has been the increasing calls, and I believe even a pledge from the Labour Party conference that should Labour win the next election, they will make up that shortfall of what the US has removed from funding of UNRWA to it. So,
Any more questions? Any thoughts or comments, please?
Yeah. Hi again. So it was just to say, I did my university, 4 years university in Florida, and I met a lot of people there and stuff, and a lot of people who consider themselves very Jewish, belong to Israel, and then some more secular, I guess, type Jewish. And there's a trip that is called Birthright that they can apply to, which blows my mind, but whatever. And I have a few of my friends that went on Birthright, and the whole principle is that if you have Jewish blood, you can basically apply to it through saying I went to go to Israel because XYZ. And there's a video. This is a comment. It's not a question. But there was a video recently that surfaced that shows a group of kids on Birthright, and one of the kids shows the map that they were handed by the tour guide, and was saying you're missing out huge chunks of what would be the West Bank and Palestinian territory and why isn't this mentioned on it? And the guy just swerves the questions left, right, and center and just doesn't answer anything whatsoever. And honestly, that made me so, I was revolted, but I was also really excited because when I was in the US, Palestine's not a word, it doesn't exist. Israel's the state, that's how the Middle East is. And I was just really glad to see this group actually wake up and be wait, this isn't what I saw on Google. This isn't the same map. This isn't accurate, you know? How are they supposed to be teaching these these Jewish kids okay, this is your land and this is where we're supposed to be, when it's not even accurate information. It's just straight up brainwashing. And I don't get how more people haven't realized that yet there, but yeah, it's crazy.
I don't know if it was the same group or a different group, but there was a video that went viral not long ago of a group of American Jewish kids who were on one of these Birthright trips that then left the trip and joined a group called Breaking the Silence, which is a group of ex-IDF soldiers who are campaigning for Palestinian rights. And they did a whole video by explaining what they've been taught as part of the Birthright trip and what's wrong with it and why they've then joined this group and the realities of occupied Palestine. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think it is very encouraging to see how much more solidarity with Palestine there is coming out of the US. And you see especially since Trump's election. But even before that, there's been this huge growth of movement from Black Lives Matter, the Women's March, March for Our Lives, these groups, and a lot of them have very strong pro-Palestinian currents in them. Black Lives Matter released a manifesto which explicitly supported Palestine and BDS. The Women's March, you have again Angela Davis and Linda Sarsour are very, very pro-Palestine. So yes, I think these are great developments.
Penny.
I just wanted to reinforce that comment about something we really struggled with this summer was this phrase, the Jewish community this, the Jewish community that. As if it was this homogenous mass, which you've quite clearly given us all the historical background, and thank you for that about why not only is it not now, but it never has been. And I think that's why your questions are so pertinent. I know whole numbers of families who have Jewish parents and grandparents will go to synagogue for Jewish funerals, but they don't follow any religion. They don't attend synagogue themselves. They would classify themselves as Jews. But also, I wanted just to talk about part of our job is exposing the barbarity of the Israelis and the sheer cruelty. I mean, I often think I've seen the worst I could possibly see on the news, and then I see something else even worse. When you talk about the doctor who was shot down, and the children of the Israelis went, oh, well, why were their children killed? Bloody hell, families come out on a Friday to protest, the whole family comes out. They're not fair game. Why were you shooting, not why were their families, is the question that I would ask. And we had a really successful demonstration in Manchester during the airstrikes on Gaza. And one of the guys who just came up to the platform was an Orthodox Jew in full gay. And he spoke very, very powerfully in support of the Palestinians. And we got some lovely photographs of him and a Muslim embracing. And it was the Jewish Chronicle in Manchester that exposed his name and address, and his calves were on, and he had to leave the city. I just think that speaks to it definitely not being a homogenous group.
Welcome at the tail end.
Classic Catholic.
Yes. Any more?
Can I just jump in?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think it was telling that during this whole anti-Semitism row over the summer that any Jewish person that spoke in favor of Jeremy Corbyn was the wrong kind of Jew, was a self-hating Jew. I was at an event in London at Conway Hall, which was called Corbyn, Anti-Semitism and Justice for Palestine, where a group of pro-Israelis tried to get in and weren't allowed in. And so they went around through the crowd asking people like, are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? Jewish people have been banned from this meeting, whatever. And there was a number of Jewish people in the crowd, so they said, yeah, we are Jewish. I said, well, what kind of Jew are you? Are you an Israeli Jew? You're not. You're a Corbyn Jew. You're a self-made, these kind of things. And I mean, that is utterly anti-Semitic. Like, you can't tell someone they're a wrong kind of Jew. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, one person who said, yeah, you're the kind of Jew who would have sent other Jews to the death camp, and all kinds of things. And it is really terrible, and it just, blows the hypocrisy of this whole argument right out. One thing I want to add, which I think it was mentioned earlier about kind of left and right and support for Israel and Palestine. It wasn't always a thing, especially in Britain, that the left supported Palestine. In fact, initially when Israel was created, it was seen as a very socialist thing to do, to support Israel, and they were the kibbutzes and people were encouraged to go in them as a socialist endeavor. And it's interesting to read about the life of Tony Cliff, who's a famous socialist in this country and who is Jewish, and when he went on one of these trips to a kibbutz in Israel was when he realized that he didn't support the idea and came back and was pro-Palestinian. So it hasn't always been that, but
we've got Netanyahu, to me, it's just really right-wing, authoritarian. Has it always been like that? Are the sort of ones in charge of the government, have they always been very hard right in that way? In that kind of way? Or is it
so Netanyahu is from a very hard right party, even in the Israeli political spectrum. But even the so-called left wing in Israel, by our standards, is quite right wing. So you had, for example, in the last election, the leader of the Israeli Labour Party, Isaac Herzog, who described himself as a liberal Zionist, was, incredibly racist against Palestinians, said things about the Arab population, and he says he supports a two-state solution but denies all kinds of Palestinian freedoms, etc. And it was that Israeli Labour Party that broke its links with Labour over Jeremy Corbyn, whatever. So yeah, so there has, and the Labour Party has been in power at times, and I think it was Ben Gurion who was one of the best presidents of Israel, who was part of the Labour Party, if I'm not wrong. So they have been in power, but within the Zionist spectrum. So.
Have the Israeli leadership got any intentions ever of coming to any kind of peace agreement? Have they ever had, and have they now? And is there any chance of it? And if there's a two-state solution, can they overcome apartheid within a two-state solution?
Okay, I knew we'd get to this question. So, as far as I know, all things I've read show that Israel has never been really interested in peace. From the way they were set up and the way they treated the Palestinians and set up their economy, set up the infrastructure, wherever. And in terms of the kind of things they talked about, and by they I mean the leaders of Israel, as to what their goals were, it was never about being at peace with the Palestinian neighbor. That was never on the table. And that is part of why the rhetoric has built up over 70 years to this constant hostility and this permanent state of war. The two-state solution, in my opinion, is not viable, and it wouldn't be fair even if it was. Currently, when people talk about a two-state solution, they effectively mean a Palestinian state within the West Bank, within what's already not occupied by Israel as settlements, and the Gaza Strip. It would necessarily mean that the 7 million Palestinian refugees have no chance of return. It would mean that the Palestinian state is split between Gaza and the West Bank. It would mean that a Palestinian state exists on less than 20% of historic Palestine, where even within the West Bank, between villages and towns, you have Israeli settlements and cities and villages. And it would necessarily mean that Palestine would be under Israeli control. Because there's no way, no one who advocates the two-state solution says this either, that Palestine could be a functioning, normal state with its own army and its own political system, separate of Israel. It would not work. But even that solution is no longer possible because you have these settlements across the West Bank, which no amount of land swaps would, create a situation where Palestine can have its own state. So I don't think it's feasible at all. And I think as socialists, what we should be arguing for is a one state where Jews and Palestinians and Christians and everyone else who lives within those borders should be allowed to live with equality and freedom and democracy and all those things. So.
Please.
I don't know if this properly relates to the topic, but my friend's wife said to me that Islam is under attack. And it's the religion of peace, and basically British people are scared of Islam taking over and being the next religion, and it's kind of I don't know, it's kind of put me in a kind of it's almost like fear of the dark, but you're told there's a monster, and then you fear the dark because this monster's been put into your head, and it's like, well, if
Before that, it was just the dark. It was just a room. And now it's like, enter this takeover of Islam. It's like, well, I'm not religious. So to me, that's quite a scary concept. Because I've spent most of my life fighting biased Christian indoctrination from people who fear every other religion in the world. And it's like, if that's being put, if that's in people's minds, how does that, is there some kind of, I don't know, paranoia vehicle being put into people's mentality to confuse us? I don't quite know how to articulate that as a question, but it's like here we're talking about politics and greed and actual invasion of a land, but then thrown into the mix, you've got this distrust of people around you of religion, and to me it seems related in a way. I can't quite
Absolutely. I think
distill it.
that's going back to a different kind of colonization, really. They're colonizing our minds in fearing each other and splitting us up and all that sort of stuff. But,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a whole other topic that we could have a whole discussion on. But I think to kind of just maybe briefly try and answer that is that, see, we've had 17 years of the war on terror, where our governments, successive governments, have had to justify why they're spending so much resources and why hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Middle Eastern Muslims are expendable, why it's okay that 1 million people were killed in Iraq. And to do that, they had to employ Islamophobic rhetoric to dehumanize Muslims. And that's why it's no surprise that the far right have used this rhetoric as something to organize around Tommy Robinson and his likes, who want to paint this picture of this Muslim threat that is invading the UK and Europe, etc. But I think that's the context we have to see it in. Is not about the actual religion or what you think of the religion. It is about racism and imperialism and where those two intersect, and how the far right manipulated, how our government manipulated to create fear and hostility, etc.
And our media, which is a
And our media.
fantastic job.
Absolutely, exactly, 100%, yeah.
If nobody's got any more questions, before we hand on for your closing reflections again, I just want to pick up on the very first comment you made about history. I think historical analysis is a very powerful tool we have in our hands. But if somebody's changing that history by design, we need to be alert to that and keep on top of our reading up, getting ourselves educated, informed of what reality is and what fake news are, because otherwise we're going to lose the plot altogether, as you were saying there. So, with that in mind, can I hand it back to you for your final analysis?
Sure. So, to kind of sum up from what we've said, I think it's fair to say that Palestine has been one of the greatest injustices of the last century, at least. And I think as socialists in Britain, which has this historical connection in the creation of Israel and the maintaining of this injustice, we have a duty to be showing solidarity with Palestine and to be doing everything we can to fight for justice for Palestine. I think one of the biggest aspects of the Palestine solidarity movement is BDS, and I think we need to be encouraging this and making it grow as much as possible. That is the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. And I think because we're in this unique situation where we have Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party, potential next Prime Minister, staunch supporter of Palestine, at the same time we have the rise of the far right, we're increasingly aligned with Israel. You have Trump, who everyone hates for some reason or the other, but kind of crystallizes what American imperialism and what the American state is all about, that we need to use this opportunity to advance the aims of supporting Palestine. And I think the biggest way we can do that today is A, to ensure Jeremy Corbyn is Prime Minister as soon as possible, and B, to be as unapologetically pro-Palestinian as possible. We need to always talk about Palestine as much as we can, and I find it particularly heartening that there's not one march that I can think of for a good cause that I don't see a Palestinian flag on. And I think we need to make sure that that continues to happen, and that Palestine is always a central part of every movement that we have, and that people understand what's going on there. So I would encourage everyone to read more about Palestine, talk to more people about Palestine, defend Jeremy Corbyn when he's under attack for being pro-Palestine, and if there's the local Stop the War and Palestine Solidarity campaign groups, get involved in the campaigns, be ready to mobilize if it comes to it, and together we can win. And let's never forget the ongoing injustices that Palestinians are facing, and if they can persevere for 70 or 100 years, then we have no excuse not to.
Before you go, a couple of announcements of events.